Today I'd like to talk a little about Masonic Rites and Appendant Bodies. They are two different animals, but sometimes they become twisted up. When I first joined Masonry, an old past master pulled me aside and told me, "You are joining a true college, a great college. You can find more valuable education in Masonry than you can imagine." Well, after 50 years of being a Mason, I very much agree with that old past master. I believe that I will continue to learn from Masonry until my last day. It is a seemingly bottomless well of available, valuable wisdom, but the burden is on me to do the work and study. In 1875, Albert Mackey wrote a paper titled, "Reading Masons and Masons Who Do Not Read." In that paper, he ended it with a most interesting line. He wrote, "The ultimate success of Masonry depends on the intelligence of her disciples." I find that a fascinating statement, as he seems to qualify the ultimate success of Freemasonry as well as the intelligence of its members. Mackey is not telling us that Masonry is successful because of the intelligence of its members. He is telling us that Masonry will be successful if it has intelligent reading members. Our lodges will have intelligent members if the lodges provide quality Masonic education and if our members take advantage of the education offered. If the lodges provide nothing more than a hot meal and a reading of the minutes, or if the members turn their back on Masonic education when it's offered, then the ultimate success that Brother Mackey spoke of will not occur. The level of success that a lodge enjoys often depends on the level of comprehension and mastery of a wide array of Masonic educational subjects available to the members. For example, a successful lodge does not require every member to be proficient in the ritual, but its officers and a significant portion of the lodge will undoubtedly have the ability in successful lodges. We must understand certain basics for the lodge's success and personal growth. An often glossed over yet significant aspect of Masonic education is the nature of Masonic rites. It seems that many in the U.S. today confuse or have but limited understanding of the differences between a Masonic Rite and an appendant body. In fact, some have firmly held incorrect opinions. A Masonic Rite and an appendant body are two different things, and understanding them is very much a part of a solid Masonic education plan. In the U.S., it is common today to believe that an appendant body is pretty much anything other than a craft lodge. Too often I read in U.S. Masonic publications and hear in lectures that the York Rite and the Scottish Rite are appendant bodies. Such a belief differs from the original understanding of how rites were viewed and is different from how they are currently recognized in most areas outside the United States. Regardless, today, the York Rite and Scottish Rite are often listed alongside organizations such as the Shriners, Grotto, Eastern Star, etc. When questioned why these two rites are considered appendant, I'm usually either given a blank stare or told that the bodies are appendant or attached to the craft lodge. I'm told they are organizations a Mason can join after receiving his Master Mason degree. That's a misunderstanding of the nature of a Masonic Rite. Of course, groups such as Shriners, the Grotto, Eastern Star, and others are appendant bodies. As a prerequisite, many of these organizations require membership in a craft lodge or obtaining the Master Mason degree. And here seems to be the source of long-held confusion about Masonic rites. So, why would I say that the York and Scottish rites differ from the Shrine, Grotto, etc.? Why do I say that they are not appendant bodies? Well, as their names suggest, the York Rite and the Scottish Rite are Masonic rites, or systems of Freemasonry. A rite or a system of Freemasonry is a collection of unique rituals beginning in the Entered Apprentice degree and concluding in whatever is their final degree. As Albert Mackey tells us, quote, "The original system of speculative masonry consisted of only 3 symbolic degrees called, therefore, ancient craft masonry. Such was the condition of Freemasonry at the time of what is called the Revival of 1717. Hence, this was the original rite or approved usage, and so it continued in England until the year 1813, when at the union of the 2 Grand Lodges, the Holy Royal Arch was declared to be part of the system, and thus the English Rite was made legitimately to consist of 4 degrees. But on the continent of Europe, the organization of new systems began at a much earlier period, and by the invention of what we know as the higher degrees, a multitude of rites were established. All of these agreed in one important essential, that they were built upon the 3 symbolic degrees in which each instance constituted the fundamental basis upon which they were erected." End quote. The important part is that while a Masonic Rite is a collection of rituals that are similar or related in content, it is not an organization itself. A Masonic Rite is not under the jurisdiction of any Masonic body or organization. A Masonic body uses or works in the rituals of a Masonic Rite. A Masonic ritual is the script used to confer degrees, open lodges, and is the words of our catechism. A regular Masonic craft ritual will contain the Haramic legend, and while the 3 craft degrees follow a logical storyline, they can sometimes be quite different from other rituals of the same degree. These differences can be looked at as the various rites of Freemasonry. The Scottish Rite and the York Rite are both considered rites because they start with their own unique craft lodge degrees and rituals. You can think of the different rites as different ways of telling the same story. Over time, translators and editors changed rituals depending on the lodges using the rituals or what was felt to be important for Masons in particular areas. For instance, a language problem existed when speculative Freemasonry was taken from England to France in its early days. It was necessary to translate the English craft rituals into French if there was any hope of a successful spreading of Freemasonry in France. When this translation was done, some consideration for French culture was given. The French rituals told the same story as the English rituals, but how the story was told became a bit different in the French versions. This evolved into the French Rite. When we compare early English and French rituals, it's easy to see that the French rituals became more theatrical. The French rituals also spent more time on aspects of symbolism than the English. This has much to do with the 2 cultures, and the differences in the rituals reflect the differences between those 2 cultures. But what does this mean in practice to have different rituals? Well, in the New Orleans area, you can today see 2 forms of Masonic craft rituals, or 2 rites, in practice, and both in the English language. One is the York Rite craft ritual, English in nature, and the other is the Scottish Rite craft ritual, which is French in nature. In a nutshell, the York Rite craft ritual is the foundation of the rest of the degrees of the system known in the U.S. as the York Rite. The Scottish Rite craft ritual is the foundation for the degrees of the Scottish Rite from the 4th to 33rd, the rest of that system. In many places outside the U.S., you can see 2 or more different craft rituals or different rites being worked. Because the evolution of the Masonic rites seemed to have been a bit haphazard, with new rites and rituals springing up almost at will, they can vary in the number of degrees and even the subject matter of the degrees above the 3rd. A Mason completing the degrees in one rite will receive a different Masonic experience than a Mason of another rite. Yes, there is a relationship between the various rites, but also clear differences. Masonic bodies working in the various rites today can be seen as selectively exclusive in membership. A Master Mason cannot visit Masonic bodies or degrees that he has not received. In addition, If one has received all of the degrees available in one rite, he is still not entitled to visit corresponding degrees and bodies of other rites unless he holds membership there as well. But what about a Master Mason in the Scottish Rite Craft Lodge in New Orleans or elsewhere? Can he visit a York Rite Lodge of Master Masons? Mackey again instructs us, quote, "Hence arises the law that whatever may be the constitution and teachings of any rite as to the higher degrees particular to it, the 3 symbolic degrees being common to all the rites, a Master Mason in any one of the rites may visit and labor in a Master's Lodge of every other rite. It is only after that degree is passed that the exclusiveness of each rite begins to operate." End quote. Yes, a Master Mason in a Scottish Rite Craft Lodge may visit and even join a York Rite Craft Lodge in New Orleans or elsewhere, and vice versa. It is a part of the education in New Orleans area craft lodges to witness the differences in the rituals of craft lodges available there and begin their understanding of Masonic rites. It becomes clear to the New Orleans area Scottish Rite Craft Masons that their ritual is the foundation for the whole of the Scottish Rite. Those Scottish Rite Craft Masons who go on to join a Scottish Rite Valley in the southern jurisdiction will see that the storyline between their 3rd degree and the 4th degree in a valley is a natural progression of their Scottish Rite ritual. Members of a York Rite Craft Lodge find the 4th degree of the Scottish Rite as recognizable, but not a natural flow in their ritual or storyline of the Haramic legend. It is clear to a York Rite Craft Mason that they have walked into a different version of the ritual count in their craft lodge. But if the Scottish Rite craft rituals and craft lodges are the foundation of the Scottish Rite degrees from the 4th to 33rd, why are these lodges so very rare in the United States? Well, let's look at it. We can see some interesting developments in Freemasonry in the areas that became the United States of America just after the American Revolution. We can trace different rituals or rites used worldwide today from early English, French, and other European rituals. Still, for this study, we will confine ourselves to the rituals that are worked in the United States today. Most craft masonry in the United States came from England, Ireland, or Scotland. While variations in these rituals existed, they all came from the same source. Freemasons in the young United States began organizing Freemasonry to suit their likes. Some thought was given to having one Grand Lodge for the entire country, but the final plan was to mirror the example of the organization of the new nation's government, meaning more consideration for the states. With that, one Grand Lodge per state was their choice. In the years that followed, Freemasonry in the United States began refining its nature and defining what it wanted from each Grand Lodge. The consensus was that each Grand Lodge should be as near as possible a copy of the other. Each would be sovereign and independent, yet very similar in the craft lodge experience of other Grand Lodges. Of course, being sovereign meant that each was free and entitled to operate as they chose best. Over the years, the Masonic craft ritual for most jurisdictions in the U.S. began to vary from a little to a sizable amount, almost defying the original suggested intention. There seems to have been an early desire for one Grand Lodge per state, one language per Grand Lodge, and that would be English, and one ritual for each Grand Lodge. When we tried to understand why they wanted the early Grand Lodges organized this way, we cannot look at any ancient charges for answers. The only logical explanation for why they wanted the U.S. Grand Lodges so like each other is because that's what they wanted, period. Most Masons in the New England states spoke English, so the logical choice was English for the lodges. The decision of how to model the lodges were based on whatever was in common use for them. So, With this one Grand Lodge, one language, and one ritual desire, the various Grand Lodges began to organize and refine themselves. Representatives of the various Grand Lodges would meet regularly to discuss the progress of Masonry in the U.S. But there was one problem for them in South Carolina. To understand the situation in South Carolina, we need to take a quick look at England. Without getting into a lengthy history of Freemasonry in England, two groups with different Masonic philosophies developed in England before 1800. One styled themselves as the Ancients and the other as the Moderns. These two Grand Lodges in England were unfriendly towards each other, but they did end up settling their differences, and in 1813 merged into what we have today as the United Grand Lodge of England. In South Carolina, just before 1800, there were also two Grand Lodges, each representing the two styles of English Freemasonry. Both were considered perfectly regular, but the problem remained that the U.S. Grand Lodge's collective desire was for one Grand Lodge per state. Pressure began being placed on South Carolina for the two Grand Lodges to merge. The problem was that they didn't like each other, and they found each other's Masonic philosophy and practice unacceptable. They did not want to merge. In 1801, a new development and a new problem came with the creation of another Masonic body in South Carolina. This body did not trace itself back to the English style of Freemasonry, but to the French style. Through the Caribbean islands, a French style of Masonry called the Order of the Royal Secret, but more commonly known at the time as the Rite of Perfection, had gained some popularity. This was a 25-degree system of French-style Masonry that was unique and quite different than the English style of Freemasonry. The problem was that it seemed poorly organized and often lacked clear central leadership. A group of Masons who had reached the highest degree in this French system met in Charleston, South Carolina, to discuss the problem with this system. Their solution was to create a new system in 1801 with a better organization and central government. The result of this creation was what we have today as the 33-degree ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. Remember, this new 33-degree French-style system, like the old 25-degree system, was a complete Masonic system, or a Masonic Rite, that included its own unique craft degrees. When this new 33-degree system was created in Charleston, its birth certificate, or public announcement, claimed to begin in the craft lodge degrees. But there was an obvious problem. South Carolina was already under considerable pressure because they had two grand bodies controlling craft degrees. The U.S. Grand Lodge community wanted these two bodies to merge so that there would be only one. The idea that a third body, also controlling craft lodges, would be allowed in that state is unthinkable. For a brand new organization with tons of potential, this was a deal-breaking problem and one that they needed to address. While the early records of the Charleston Supreme Council, or Southern Jurisdiction, do not exist, we can assume that there was a strong outside objection or expected objection to a new body in South Carolina controlling craft degrees. If the young Charleston Council ever did attempt to work in the craft degrees of the Scottish Rite, it would have undoubtedly have been short-lived. But we have no information one way or the other. All we know from the existing records is that at some point the Supreme Council officially confined its degrees from the 4th to the 33rd. There seems to have been an adjustment period and a figuring out of what they wanted to do and how they would operate. It was, after all, a brand new body and a brand new rite. It seems reasonable that the early Charleston Supreme Council decided to give up their craft lodges in trade for the chance to exist. Without question, if the Charleston Council had insisted on working in or controlling Scottish Rite craft lodges, they would have had but a short existence. But outside the United States, the Scottish Rite craft lodge ritual is one of the most popular for well-recognized Grand Lodges in Central America, South America, and Europe. So, let's go back to the beginning of this lecture and the current belief among many that the York Rite and the Scottish Rites are appendant bodies. Well, how did we arrive at this way of thinking? I believe that the lack of proper Masonic education in human nature are the leading causes for this misconception and misuse of the term. What do we see if we look at the Scottish Rite in almost all areas of the U.S.? Most experience the Scottish Rite as a 29-degree system. The degrees of the Scottish Rite, from what can be seen by many, span the 4th to 32nd. Many, and more than we may assume, view the 33rd degree as an honorary degree or award given to some 32nds. They do not see the 33rd as a real degree of the Scottish Rite. We know about the Supreme Council, but view it as more of an administrative body. The York Rite is seen as a collection of loosely associated independent bodies given the general term of York Rite. Most view the Craft Lodge as an independent entity of no particular rite, it's just the Craft Lodge. Both the Scottish Rite and the York Rite are viewed as organizations that a Master Mason can join if he wishes. For many years, and in my opinion, the source of much confusion was the necessity for one with a desire to join the Shriners to first join either the York Rite or the Scottish Rite. The York Rite and Scottish Rite held no deeper meaning or importance than being a stepping stone. Of course, in too many cases, if we wanted to learn about the Scottish Rite history, a good portion of what we would receive was the near endless and pointless arguments to try and show why one Mason, Joseph Serno, was irregular and his Scottish Rite was not real Scottish Rite, as well as wholly undesirable and worthless. In the end, no matter which side you fell on in the Serno regularity question, it provided no help at all in understanding the profoundly beautiful philosophy of the Scottish Rite. If Serno were 100% regular and a saint of a Mason, it would change nothing as to the importance of the Scottish Rite any more than if he was the devil's own child. I'm not saying that Scottish Rite history is unimportant, but I believe it needs to be studied after understanding the philosophy. Scottish Rite craft lodges in the U.S. became somehow and incorrectly tied to Serno Masonry and viewed as irregular Masonry simply because that's what some said of them. Young Masons were molded into believing that the Scottish Rite is a 29-degree system and that the Scottish Rite Craft Lodge should not be allowed to exist. So these lodges, at least in the U.S., were forgotten by some and unknown by others. In time, these young Scottish Rite Masons were the senior Masons, and this unfortunate innovation became accepted as law. It is profoundly misleading, uninformed, and dangerous to view the foundation of such an important and beautiful system as the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite as irregular and unworthy of use. And what of the York Rite? Which degrees are considered part of the York Rite? From the website titled York Rite Freemasonry Official Information, quote, "The York Rite, or more correctly, the American Rite, is based on the early remnants of craft masonry that were practiced in the early 1700s. Thus, unlike the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, which claims to hold the power of conferring the first 3 degrees of Masonry in addition to those under its jurisdiction, those found of the York Rite have rightfully acknowledged the fact that they are considered appendant to those of craft Masonry." End quote. What does that mean? Let's look at it. At some point, the York Rite seems to have forgotten or disowned its own craft lodges. During the late 1900s, the York Rite seemed to disconnect itself from the craft lodge with its membership open to Master Masons. With this, the Craft Lodge, the York Rite, and the Scottish Rite became three separate entities, with both rites somehow becoming appendant to the Craft Lodge. But to which rite did the Craft Lodge belong? None? Interesting explanations began to develop. Look again at what is written on this website about how some today view the York Rite and how some compare it with the Scottish Rite. Unlike the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, which claims to hold the power of conferring the first 3 degrees of Masonry in addition to those under its jurisdiction. What? There are no Masonic rites holding the power of conferring any of the degrees of Masonry. Masonic bodies, not rites, hold such power. A Masonic Rite is simply a collection of similar rituals. This is clearly the heart of the misunderstanding. It's a twisting up of Masonic rites and Masonic bodies. At some point, the term rite became confused with body, and when speaking of the Scottish Rite or York Rite, it became to be understood to mean certain Masonic bodies or organizations. This is a truly misleading and altogether incorrect understanding of the terms. A Masonic body is an organization that works or labors in degrees of a Masonic Rite. A Masonic Rite is a collection of similar rituals that begins with the Eminent Apprentice degree or the craft degrees. It's nothing more and nothing less. Certain Masonic bodies control certain Masonic degrees. A Scottish Rite Lodge of Perfection does not confer the Master Mason degree of its own right any more than a York Rite chapter confers the York Rite Master Mason degree. A Craft Lodge confers the Master Mason degree of every rite. But then again, a Scottish Rite Lodge of Perfection does not have the authority on its own to confer the 33rd degree any more than a York Rite chapter confers the Knight Templar degree. Certain Masonic bodies control and confer certain degrees regardless of the rites being worked. The Craft Lodge degrees of any rite are conferred in craft lodges and in no other bodies. In the early days of U.S. Freemasonry, it was agreed that craft lodges would be under the jurisdiction of Grand Lodges. Why this was agreed upon is a question for another paper. A Grand Lodge is a Masonic body, just like the craft lodges under its jurisdiction. A Grand Lodge's ritual and its opening and closing of the Grand Lodge is part of a Masonic Rite, just like the rituals used by the lodges under its jurisdiction. At some point, maybe born out of the internet's self-indulgent, dubious wisdom of Wikipedia, York Rite Masons developed this idea that the York Rite begins following the Master Mason degree. The York Rite became a collection of independent bodies and not a collection of related rituals. In the same manner of misunderstanding, Grand Lodges developed the idea that the Scottish Rite craft rituals were completely irregular and should never be allowed to be worked by any craft lodge under their jurisdiction. Of course, many who held this opinion were perfectly agreeable to receiving the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite, as it was a coveted honor to which they felt wholly entitled. The irony of accepting part of a Masonic system, yet rejecting another part of the same system, is astonishing. We are in a most exciting time. Young men do seem to be coming to our doors once again, but they are coming with more questions. They expect reasonable, accurate answers. They read, and more than just the internet. I believe that the next years will determine our ultimate level of success in Freemasonry. Thank you for watching. If you like the videos, please hit the like button and subscribe to us. See you next time.